So we have our quick notes here for this topic in the what we call Unit 0 on functions, and we're going to be talking specifically here about multiple representations. So definitely can go ahead and talk about functions and their multiple representations. So generally speaking, we have three ways that we really view functions, and we can use those functions to evaluate, and that would be from tables, graphs, or an equation. So generally speaking, as we move through this class, we're going to see a lot more equations and graphs, and we will have tables pop up in terms of being able to model different pieces of data from time to time. But we've seen already on this paper tables and graphs and equations. And if I go back up to the front here of this piece of paper, in terms of the tables, that would be where we have, in this situation, our F. So anytime that I saw this letter F, it plays out for the table here. Anytime that I saw the graph, that was our g of x, which appears here and here. And then also, if I talked about my letter h, that was my equation. So anytime I saw the letter h. So we use different letters to label functions so that if we have multiple situations going on all at one time, we can differentiate between them. And in this situation, we're seeing the multiple representations between equations and tables and graphs. Some other notes to kind of jot down here for us is that we know that given an input, we're going to try to find the corresponding output. And in order to do that, especially with equations, we would take that input and we go ahead and figure out the output. So these are things that we kind of sort of talked about in the previous one, but let's just jot it down just to remember that given an input, and if we're dealing with a coordinate plane, that's our x value, we want to go ahead and find the corresponding output. Which is the letter y for us situationally in this. Now, we've mentioned input and output, and what I want to do for a moment here is to just talk about those phrases, and the reasoning behind that is because we're going to see some other additional things pop up here in reference to this. So when I see the phrase input, I want to make sure that there's a connection there. A lot of the times we're going to see the letter X on our coordinate plane, but more so we're also going to start referencing this phrasing domain. So for us, when we see, and especially when we move into Unit 1, when we're talking about domain, what we're talking about here is all of our X values. So our X values are controlled and can be classified as domain values. We're going to make sure we kind of reference this as much as possible early on so we get used to it. Obviously, corresponding to that, of course, would be the fact that if I have an input that's X and its domain, that for us here, our output or our Y value is referred to a lot also as the phrase range. It's not the statistic range where you think about the greatest number minus the smallest number, but we're talking about our range as being all the y values here. Now, I suppose I highlighted too much there in this specific picture, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. Let's go ahead and just erase some of this. Try this again because it's not as tall as our graph would go. Let's try this again. There's the range of this specific function. So domain and range is a way to kind of come up with some phrasing. So for the range, that would be all of our y values. And domain is a phrase that we talk about. Let's backtrack there, use a different pen. And domain is all of our x values. So just a different way to group things up. But again, the main focus here right now is talking about different ways that we can represent functions, and of course, being able to get certain outputs based off of inputs that we're given.